43 years of marriage, and she just threw him under the bus in Judge Caprio's courtroom. Now, I want you to imagine something for a moment. Picture yourself sitting in a quiet courtroom in Providence, Rhode Island. The morning light filters through tall windows, casting long shadows across wooden benches that have witnessed thousands of stories. Judge Frank Caprio sits behind his bench, a man whose weathered hands and kind eyes have guided countless people through some of their most difficult moments. Today's case seemed routine enough. Another red light violation, another citation, another person hoping for a second chance. But what was about to unfold in that courtroom would become one of the most unforgettable moments in Judge Caprio's decades-long career. Because sometimes the most extraordinary stories come disguised as the most ordinary moments. This isn't just a story about a traffic ticket. This is a story about love, loyalty, truth, and what happens when 43 years of marriage collides with a moment of absolute honesty that nobody, absolutely nobody, saw coming. The Providence Municipal Court was settling into another Tuesday morning routine. The bailiff was organizing papers, court reporters were adjusting their equipment, and Judge Caprio was reviewing the day's docket with that characteristic blend of curiosity and compassion that has made him beloved by millions around the world. He had seen it all in his decades on the bench: tearful mothers, defiant teenagers, confused tourists, and hard-working people caught between life's demands and the city's parking regulations. But even after all these years, Judge Caprio approached each case with fresh eyes because he understood something that many in his position had forgotten. Behind every citation was a human being with a story worth hearing. The morning air was crisp, and Federal Hill, the heart of Providence's Italian-American community, was already bustling with activity. Somewhere in that neighborhood, just hours earlier, a red light had turned from yellow to red. A car had proceeded through the intersection, and a camera had captured a moment that would soon become the centerpiece of an unforgettable courtroom drama. The bailiff's voice cut through the quiet murmur of the courtroom. Next case, red light violation, intersection of Federal Hill and Atwells Avenue, case number 2847. Judge Caprio looked up from his papers, expecting to see what he had seen thousands of times before: a nervous defendant, perhaps with a family member for moral support, ready to explain why this particular ticket was a mistake, an emergency, or simply an unfortunate moment of human error. But what walked through those heavy courtroom doors was something that would challenge every assumption about routine traffic cases. Through the doors came an elderly couple moving with the careful dignity that comes with 8 decades of living. The man was impeccably dressed in a pressed button-down shirt and clean slacks, his silver hair combed neatly, walking with the measured steps of someone who had learned to navigate the world with both caution and pride. Beside him, a woman of similar age moved with purpose, her purse clutched firmly in hands that had held babies, signed mortgage papers, and applauded at countless graduation ceremonies. But there was something in her expression, a determined set to her jaw, a slight narrowing of her eyes, that suggested this was not going to be a typical morning in traffic court. As they approached the defendant's table, Judge Caprio felt that familiar stirring of interest that came when a case promised to be more than it appeared. After 4 decades of marriage himself, he had developed an instinct for reading the subtle dynamics between couples. And something about the way these two were positioned, close enough to be together, but with a careful space between them, that spoke volumes, told him that this red light violation might be the least interesting part of whatever was about to unfold. The court clerk adjusted her microphone and prepared to record another routine proceeding. The few spectators in the gallery, other defendants waiting their turn, a couple of law students observing court procedures, a local reporter who covered municipal court for the community newspaper, had no idea they were about to witness something that would be talked about for years to come. Judge Caprio cleared his throat gently, a sound that had become as familiar to Providence residents as the bells of St. Bartholomew's Church on Federal Hill. "Good morning," he said, his voice carrying that warm authority that made people feel heard rather than judged. "Please, step forward and state your names for the record." The man stepped forward slightly, a gesture of old-fashioned courtesy that suggested he had been raised in an era when men opened doors for women and stood when a lady entered the room. His voice, when he spoke, carried the faint traces of an accent that spoke of immigrant parents and childhood conversations conducted in both English and Italian. "Your Honor, my name is Robert Benedetto, and this is my wife, Dorothy Benedetto." Judge Caprio smiled, recognizing the name as one that belonged to the tight-knit community of Federal Hill, where families had known each other for generations and where reputation still mattered more than wealth. The Benedetto name was familiar, not famous, but familiar in the way that comes from decades of quiet, honest living in a small community. Dorothy stepped forward as well, and Judge Caprio noticed immediately that she carried herself with the confidence of a woman who had spent 43 years managing a household, raising children, and making decisions that mattered. Her gray hair was styled with care, her clothes were modest but neat, and her eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone who missed very little. "Mr. and Mrs. Benedetto," Judge Caprio said, consulting the file before him, "I see here that we're dealing with a red light violation that occurred last Tuesday at approximately 2:47 p.m. at the intersection of Federal Hill and Atwells Avenue." He looked up from the papers, his experienced eyes taking in the couple before him. Robert appeared nervous, shifting his weight from one foot to the other in the way of a man who was not comfortable being the center of attention. Dorothy, however, stood perfectly still, her posture erect, her gaze steady. There was something about her stillness that suggested she had been preparing for this moment. "Now," Judge Caprio continued, "Robert, according to the citation, you were operating the vehicle at the time of the violation. Can you tell me what happened that day?" It was a standard question, asked thousands of times before. Judge Caprio expected a standard answer, an apology, an excuse, perhaps a request for leniency based on a clean driving record or financial hardship. What he did not expect was for Robert to open his mouth to respond, only to be interrupted by the most unexpected intervention in his decades on the bench. "Your Honor," Dorothy said, her voice cutting through the courtroom air with the clarity of a church bell. "Before my husband says anything, I have something very important to tell you." Judge Caprio's eyebrows rose slightly. In all his years presiding over traffic court, family members had offered support, provided character references, even occasionally tried to claim responsibility for violations they hadn't committed. But there was something in Dorothy's tone, a formality mixed with barely contained emotion, that suggested this was going to be different. "Of course, Mrs. Benedetto. Please go ahead." Robert turned to look at his wife, his expression shifting from nervous anticipation to growing alarm. After 43 years of marriage, he had learned to read the subtle signs of his wife's moods, and something about her posture, her breathing, her carefully controlled expression was sending warning signals that he couldn't quite interpret. Dorothy looked directly at Judge Caprio, her hands clasped in front of her, with the solemnity of someone making a confession that had been weighing on her conscience. "Your Honor, I want to be absolutely clear about what happened that day, because I believe that truth matters, especially in a court of law." She paused, and in that pause, the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. The court reporter's fingers hovered over her keyboard. The bailiff looked up from his paperwork. Even the law students in the back row leaned forward slightly. "My husband," Dorothy continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, "was driving that car. He ran that red light. And I am tired, absolutely tired, of him blaming me for his driving mistakes." The silence that followed was so complete that the sound of the courthouse clock ticking became audible. Robert's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, disbelief, and finally, a dawning realization that his wife of 43 years had just done something unprecedented. Judge Caprio blinked once, twice, and then did something he rarely did. In his courtroom, he laughed. Not mockingly, not dismissively, but with the warm, appreciative laughter of a man who had just witnessed something both shocking and utterly human. "Mrs. Benedetto," Judge Caprio said, still chuckling, Are you testifying against your husband?" "I am testifying for the truth, Your Honor." Robert finally found his voice, though it came out as more of a croak than his usual confident tone. "Dorothy, what in the world are you doing?" Dorothy turned to face her husband fully, and suddenly every person in that courtroom became witness to 43 years of marriage compressed into a single, explosive moment. "What am I doing, Robert? What am I doing?" Her voice rose with each word, carrying the weight of decades of accumulated frustration. "I am telling the truth for once. Do you know how many times over the past 43 years you have blamed me for your driving mistakes?" The courtroom was no longer a formal legal proceeding. It had become something far more intimate and real. Judge Caprio leaned back in his chair, recognizing that he was witnessing something that transcended traffic violations and municipal ordinances. This was about marriage, about truth, about the small daily negotiations that either bind couples together or slowly tear them apart. "Let me get this straight," Judge Caprio said, his voice carrying both amusement and genuine curiosity. "How long did you say you've been married?" 3 years, Dorothy announced, her voice carrying both pride and exasperation in equal measure. "Years next month," Robert corrected weakly, as if the additional few weeks might somehow mitigate the enormity of what was happening. Judge Caprio nodded slowly. As someone who had been married for over 4 decades himself, he understood the complex choreography of long marriages, the way couples developed their own private languages, their own systems of blame and forgiveness, their own ways of navigating the thousands of small conflicts that arise when two people attempt to build a life together. "And Dorothy," he continued, "in these 43 years has Robert been, let's say, creative with the truth about who was driving during various traffic incidents?" Dorothy's eyes lit up with the fervor of someone who had finally found a sympathetic audience for a grievance that had been building for decades. "Your Honor, just last month, he got a parking ticket outside Tony's restaurant on Federal Hill." A parking ticket. And when I asked him about it, he told me I must have parked wrong when we went there for dinner. "That's different," Robert protested. "How is that different?" "Because you did park that time." "Robert Benedetto, I was inside the restaurant ordering your chicken parmigiana while you were parallel parking that car." The courtroom erupted in quiet laughter, and Judge Caprio found himself in the unusual position of needing to maintain order, not because of disruption, but because of genuine entertainment. "Mrs. Benedetto," Judge Caprio said, raising his hand for quiet while trying to suppress his own smile, "it sounds like this has been an ongoing issue in your marriage." "Ongoing?" Dorothy's voice reached a pitch that suggested 43 years of suppressed frustration were finally finding their outlet. "Your Honor, this man has been blaming me for his driving since the Carter administration." "Now that's not true," Robert said, though his protest lacked conviction. "Oh, it's not? What about the speeding ticket in 1987? You were speeding that day. I was 7 months pregnant with our daughter Linda, and I was in the passenger seat reading a baby name book. How exactly was I speeding?" Judge Caprio was now openly grinning, and several people in the gallery were struggling to contain their laughter. But beneath the humor, he could see something deeper unfolding, a woman who had reached a breaking point, not over this particular ticket, but over a pattern of behavior that had been building for decades. "What about the fender bender in 1993? Dorothy continued, apparently having compiled a comprehensive mental file of automotive grievances spanning multiple decades. "That was foggy weather. You backed into a mailbox in our own driveway, Robert." "Our own driveway, and you told the insurance company that I must have done it when I got the groceries." "I was confused. You were embarrassed." Judge Caprio held up his hand again, but he was clearly enjoying this unprecedented glimpse into the private dynamics of a marriage that had survived more than 4 decades. "Let me ask you both something," he said, his voice taking on that familiar tone of gentle authority mixed with genuine curiosity that had made him beloved by viewers around the world. "Robert, Dorothy, after 43 years of marriage, what made this particular ticket the final straw?" Dorothy looked at her husband, and for a moment, her expression softened slightly. When she spoke again, her voice carried not just frustration, but something deeper. A kind of weary love that comes only from decades of choosing to stay committed to someone who regularly drives you to the brink of madness. "Your Honor, last week Robert got pulled over for rolling through a stop sign on Hope Street. A stop sign. And when he came home, he told me the officer said I should drive more carefully in the future." Robert's face reddened. "I was trying to protect you from feeling bad by making me think I was losing my mind." Judge Caprio leaned forward, recognizing that this conversation had moved far beyond municipal violations and into territory that was both more personal and more universal than anything typically heard in traffic court. "Robert, let me ask you something man to man. And I want you to really think about this before you answer." The courtroom fell silent again, sensing that something important was about to be said. In these 43 years of marriage, how many times has Dorothy actually taken the blame for something you did wrong? The question hung in the air like incense in a cathedral, heavy, meaningful, impossible to ignore. Robert looked at his hands, then at his wife, then back at the judge. For the first time since entering the courtroom, he seemed to be really considering not just this ticket, but the larger pattern of behavior that had brought them to this moment. "Well, Your Honor." "Don't you well him," Dorothy interjected, but her voice had lost some of its earlier fire. "Tell him about the time you dented the neighbor's car door and told them it must have happened when I was at the grocery store. You said you wouldn't bring that up anymore. That was before you tried to pin a red light violation on me." Judge Caprio watched this exchange with the fascination of someone witnessing a masterclass in marital dynamics. But beneath the humor and the obvious affection these two people still felt for each other, he could see something that touched him deeply. A woman who had spent 43 years being the strong one, the reliable one, the one who kept things running smoothly, and who had finally reached a moment where she needed someone, anyone, to acknowledge that she deserved better. "Robert," Judge Caprio said quietly, "I'm going to ask you again, and I want you to think carefully about your answer. Were you driving the car when that red light violation occurred?" The courtroom fell completely silent. Dorothy looked at her husband with a mixture of expectation and something that might have been hope. Robert looked at his wife, then at the judge, then at his hands folded in front of him. The silence stretched for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. Finally, Robert looked up, met Judge Caprio's eyes, and sighed. The sigh of a man who knew that 43 years of small deceptions had finally caught up with him. "Yes, Your Honor, I was driving." The admission came out quietly, but in the acoustics of the courtroom, it seemed to echo. Dorothy's shoulders relaxed slightly, not with triumph, but with something that looked like relief. Judge Caprio sat back in his chair and studied the couple before him. After decades on the bench and in his own marriage, he had developed an ability to see past the surface drama to the deeper currents that drove human behavior. What he saw in Robert and Dorothy Benedetto was not a marriage in crisis, but a marriage that had reached one of those pivotal moments that either strengthens or weakens the bonds between two people. "Dorothy, Robert," he began, his voice taking on that warm, fatherly tone that had made him beloved by millions. "Let me tell you something about marriage." Both spouses turned their full attention to the judge, sensing that this was no longer about traffic violations, but about something much more fundamental. "I've been married for over 40 years myself, 43 years next spring, actually." He smiled at this coincidence, and both Robert and Dorothy looked surprised and somehow pleased to discover they shared this milestone with someone they had only just met. "And in those 40-plus years, I've learned some things about what makes a marriage work. Some of those lessons I learned the hard way. Some I learned by watching other couples, and some I learned right here in this courtroom, watching people like you work through the small conflicts that can either destroy a relationship or make it stronger. Judge Caprio's voice carried the weight of experience, and everyone in the courtroom, not just Robert and Dorothy, but the law students, the court staff, even the reporter, found themselves leaning in to hear what came next. Marriage is about many things. It's about love, certainly. It's about commitment, absolutely. It's about forgiveness, without question. But it's also about something that people don't talk about enough. Something that might seem small, but is actually enormous. He paused, looking directly at Robert. It's about taking responsibility for your actions, especially the small ones, especially the ones that don't seem to matter very much. The words settled over the courtroom like snow, soft, but somehow covering everything. Robert, when you blame Dorothy for your driving mistakes, you're not just avoiding a traffic ticket. You're avoiding something much more important. You're avoiding being the husband she deserves. Robert's face showed a mixture of shame and recognition, as if he was seeing clearly for the first time something he had been avoiding looking at for decades. And Dorothy, Judge Caprio continued, after 43 years, you had every right to set the record straight. But let me ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. She nodded, waiting. After we resolve this ticket, after you leave this courtroom, are you going to forgive him? The question caught Dorothy off guard. She had come into the courtroom prepared for battle, armed with 43 years of accumulated grievances and ready to finally have her day in court. But Judge Caprio's question cut through all of that to something much deeper. The daily choice that keeps marriages alive through decades of small irritations and major disappointments. She looked at Robert, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time in months. She saw the man who had walked her down the aisle of St. Bartholomew's Church in 1980, who had held her hand during 3 difficult pregnancies, who had worked double shifts to help pay for their children's education, who had sat beside her hospital bed during her cancer scare 5 years earlier, who still brought her coffee in bed every Sunday morning despite his arthritis making it difficult to carry the tray. "Of course I'm going to forgive him," she said quietly, and her voice carried both exasperation and something deeper. The kind of love that survives red lights and blame games and 43 years of learning how to be human together. "He's my husband," the simple declaration seemed to change the entire atmosphere in the courtroom. Robert's shoulders relaxed, and he looked at his wife with an expression that mixed gratitude with something that might have been renewed appreciation. Judge Caprio smiled, the kind of smile that comes from witnessing something genuinely beautiful in the midst of an ordinary day. "You know," he said, "in all my years on this bench, I've seen a lot of couples. I've seen couples who blame each other for everything. Couples who can't take responsibility for anything. Couples who have forgotten how to forgive. But I've also seen couples like you, couples who drive each other crazy, but who show up for each other when it matters." He gestured toward the 2 of them, standing side by side despite everything that had transpired. "You came here together. Today, after 43 years of marriage, after decades of small arguments and big disagreements, after this particular conflict over who was driving, you still came here together. That tells me everything I need to know about your relationship." Judge Caprio opened the file in front of him and studied the red light violation one more time. But everyone in the courtroom understood that the piece of paper in his hands was far less important than the 2 people standing before him and what their presence here together represented. "Robert," he said, his voice taking on the formal tone of legal proceedings while maintaining the warmth that had characterized the entire interaction. "You ran that red light. You know it. Dorothy knows it. This courtroom knows it, and now the official record reflects it." Robert nodded, accepting responsibility not just for the traffic violation, but implicitly for the pattern of behavior that had brought them to this moment. "But here's what I also know," Judge Caprio continued. "You've been married for 43 years. That doesn't happen by accident. That doesn't happen because everything is easy. That happens because two people decide every single day to choose each other again, even when choosing each other is difficult, even when the other person does things that drive you absolutely crazy. He looked at Dorothy, then back at Robert, then at both of them together. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to dismiss this ticket. The announcement hit the courtroom like a small explosion. Dorothy's eyebrows shot up in surprise. Robert looked stunned. Several people in the gallery audibly gasped. But Judge Caprio continued, raising his finger with the authority of someone who had not finished speaking. I'm dismissing it on several conditions. Robert straightened up, ready to agree to whatever terms were about to be set. First, Robert, you owe your wife an apology. Not just for this ticket, but for all the times over the past 43 years that you've let her take responsibility for your mistakes. A real apology, the kind that acknowledges that she deserves better and commits to doing better. Yes, Your Honor. Absolutely. Second, Dorothy, you deserve a celebration. 43 years of putting up with this man's driving mistakes deserves at least a very nice dinner at the restaurant of your choice. And Robert, you're paying. The courtroom burst into applause, and Dorothy was beaming with a mixture of vindication and genuine affection for the judge who had so clearly understood what this case was really about. But most importantly, Judge Caprio said, raising his voice slightly to be heard over the applause, I want both of you to remember something. The applause died down, and the courtroom fell quiet again as Judge Caprio prepared to deliver what everyone sensed would be the most important part of this entire proceeding. Robert, Dorothy, I want you to listen carefully to what I'm about to say, because I think it matters not just for your marriage, but for everyone who's listening. He paused, looking around the courtroom at the law students, the court staff, the other defendants waiting their turn, the reporter who was frantically taking notes. And years of marriage is not just an accomplishment, it's a testament to something that our world desperately needs to remember. In a time when people give up on each other too easily, when relationships are treated as disposable, when the first sign of conflict sends people running for the exits, you two have chosen something different. His voice carried the weight of personal experience and professional wisdom accumulated over decades of watching people navigate the most difficult aspects of human relationships. Yes, you argue. Yes, you blame each other for things. Yes, you probably drive each other. Absolutely. Crazy sometimes, but you're here. After 43 years, after raising children together, after surviving whatever challenges life has thrown at you, after this particular conflict over a red light violation, you're still here, together. Dorothy reached over and took Robert's hand, a gesture so natural and unconscious that it seemed to prove Judge Caprio's point better than any words could. Marriage isn't about being perfect, he continued. It's not about never making mistakes or never disappointing each other. It's about making the choice, again and again, to work through the imperfections, to forgive the mistakes, to love each other, despite the disappointments. Judge Caprio's voice took on that warm, paternal quality that had made him beloved by viewers around the world. And sometimes, marriage is about having the courage to call each other out when we're not being our best selves. Dorothy, you did something brave today. You stood up for yourself and for the truth. That's not betrayal, that's love. The kind of love that says, I care enough about you and about us to demand that we do better. He looked directly at Robert. And, Robert, the fact that you're standing here, listening to this, accepting responsibility, still holding your wife's hand after she threw you under the bus, that tells me you understand something important about love too. You understand that being called out isn't the end of love, it's an invitation to love better. As the couple prepared to leave, Judge Caprio called them back one more time, recognizing that this moment, this intersection of law and life, of justice and humanity, deserved a proper conclusion. Robert, Dorothy, before you go, let me leave you with something that I hope you'll remember long after you've forgotten about red lights and traffic tickets. They turned back to face him, and everyone in the courtroom sensed that they were about to hear something important, not just for this couple, but for anyone who had ever tried to love another person through the challenges of ordinary life. Real love, the kind that lasts 43 years, isn't the love of fairy tales or romantic movies. It's not perfect or pretty or easy. It's the love that shows up in courtrooms and argues about who was driving. It's the love that gets frustrated and calls each other out and sometimes wants to scream. But it's also the love that forgives, that takes responsibility, that keeps choosing the same person even when that person drives you absolutely crazy. Judge Caprio's voice filled with the emotion of someone who had witnessed countless human dramas but was still moved by the resilience of the human spirit. What I saw here today wasn't a marriage in trouble. What I saw was a marriage that's strong enough to survive truth-telling, honest enough to call out bad behavior, and mature enough to work through conflict without giving up on each other. He smiled at them with genuine affection. That's not just admirable, that's inspirational. In a world where people are looking for examples of how to love well, how to stay committed, how to build something that lasts, you two are providing a masterclass. Not because you're perfect, but because you're real. As Robert and Dorothy walked toward the courtroom doors, something beautiful happened. Robert stopped, turned to his wife, and in front of everyone present, said something that would be remembered by everyone who witnessed it. Dorothy, I'm sorry. Not just about the ticket, but about all of it. You deserve better, and I'm going to try to do better. Dorothy looked at her husband, this man who had been driving her crazy for 43 years, and her response was everything anyone could hope for in a marriage. I know you are, Robert. And I love you anyway. They walked out of the courtroom hand in hand, laughing together for the first time that morning, and Judge Caprio watched them go with the satisfaction of someone who had just witnessed something that reminded him why he had chosen to spend his career in service to people rather than merely to law. After the couple left, Judge Caprio sat quietly for a moment, looking out at the courtroom that had just witnessed something extraordinary disguised as something ordinary. A red light violation had become a meditation on marriage. A traffic ticket had become a testimony to the power of truth-telling in relationships. And a routine court proceeding had become a reminder of what real love actually looks like. Sometimes, he said to the remaining people in the courtroom, the most profound moments happen in the most unexpected places. A traffic court, a red light ticket, a couple married for 43 years, and suddenly you're witnessing something that reminds you what love really means. His words carried the weight of someone who had spent a lifetime watching people at their best and worst, their most vulnerable and most courageous. It's not fairy tale love. It's not perfect or effortless or always kind. It's beautifully, messily, wonderfully human. It's the love that survives red lights and blame games and decades of figuring out how to build a life with someone who is just as flawed and just as trying and just as worthy of love as you are. Judge Caprio closed the file on his desk, but the lessons of Robert and Dorothy Benedetto's 43-year marriage would remain with everyone who witnessed their morning in court. And sometimes, he concluded, that's exactly what justice looks like too. Not perfect, not easy, but deeply, profoundly human. The courtroom slowly returned to its regular rhythm, but something had changed. Everyone present had been reminded of something important about love, about truth, about the courage it takes to stay committed to another person through all the small irritations and major disappointments that come with building a life together. This story isn't just about Robert and Dorothy Benedetto. It's about all of us who have ever tried to love someone through the challenges of ordinary life. What would you have done in Judge Caprio's position? Should love and loyalty factor into legal decisions? And if you've been married for years, whether 5 or 50, what's your secret to making it work through all the red lights and blame games and moments when you want to throw each other under the bus? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us your stories of love that survives, imperfection, relationships that thrive on truth-telling, and the moments when you've had to choose between being right and being kind. Because if Robert and Dorothy taught us anything, it's that real love isn't about being perfect. It's about showing up, telling the truth, taking responsibility, and choosing each other again and again, even when it's hard. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories from Judge Caprio's courtroom, where justice always comes with a generous helping of humanity, and where the most ordinary moments often reveal the most extraordinary truths about what it means to love and be loved.